And we're back with our conversation about presidents and generals. Gene Edward Smith, let me ask you about George Bush's legacy in the Republican Party. We're having an election that's quite extraordinary right now. What, though, during George W. Bush's term, how did he leave and fit into the Republican Party when he was done with his 8 years?
Bush has been exemplary as an ex-president. He simply has stayed out of politics totally. And I think he's set a style for what ex-president should be. In fact, when his brother was contesting the Republican nomination, he waited until just before the Florida primary to say anything at all, and then he grudgingly backed his brother for the nomination. But George's post-presidential years really placed him in a class by himself. Yeah. He is exemplary as an ex-president.
And as a sitting president, he had, he came in talking about education, a humble foreign policy, which was a new kind of Republican. He had good relationship with Hispanic voters. And then at the end of his term, when he supported the bailout at the economic, he had some clashes with the Republican Party.
Well, that's right. Medicare
Part D,
for seniors was a clash with the Republican Party. So that's right. It was 9/11 is the watershed in Bush's presidency, but domestically he also internationally led the fight against AIDS, and really deserves great credit for the fight against AIDS and internationally. No Child Left Behind, prescription drugs for seniors, and handling the 2008 turndown, the near depression that we faced. He relied on Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke and bailed out, which again is contrary to much Republican.
That's right, and he won't be attending the convention this time around, as he's told us. Arthur Herman, let me ask you about MacArthur as a presidential candidate. What? Tell us a little bit about. It seems in my reading he's kind of constantly being thought of as like, oh, he might run this time and then he doesn't. What was that like for him? And then also, what would he have been like as a president?
He was willing to take the job if it was put forward for him. And his name comes up fairly regularly, really from 1940 on, as a possible 40, 44, 48. There's some reason to believe that one of the things that was a kind of a wedge issue between him and Roosevelt was precisely Roosevelt knowing this guy could be my competitor, in the fall, in a presidential year. His big opportunity, though, of course, came after ironically, after being fired by Truman as Supreme Commander in Korea, when he comes back to the United States and he goes on basically a nationwide tour, where he's treated almost as a kind of national savior. I mean, 250,000 people turning out for these ticker tape parades in New York and in Chicago and in San Francisco. It's bound to turn anybody's head.
Right.
And if MacArthur's head wasn't already turned, that would certainly do it. And after the speech of the joint session of Congress, he really did feel that this was launching his presidential bid, and he was really set to go. He does run as a full-fledged candidate in 52, puts his hat into the ring, and when he arrives at the convention in Chicago, he has a grand total of 10 delegates.
Yeah. He couldn't get around.
Doesn't really. He was not suited to the presidential campaign role. It did not work for him. What would it be like as a president? I think in many ways what Eisenhower did pretty much fits with what you would have seen MacArthur do in a lot of ways. He was, in certain degrees, a Taft Republican. When he gets to the convention with his 10 delegates, he endorses Taft before he endorses Eisenhower. But he was, unlike a lot of Taft Republicans, he was someone who was reconciled with large sections of the New Deal. I think you could definitely see MacArthur embracing something like the interstate highway system. What he had also done, and I think this is important for both Eisenhower and MacArthur together, is that they really brought the Republican Party into the new consensus with the Democrat Party on the Cold War and on American foreign policy. The bitterness that had been raging since the fall of China in the late 40s and early 50s,
and
driven by men like Joe McCarthy, MacArthur and Eisenhower together really bring about a reconciliation between the two parties on this key issue.
How do you think he would have handled the civil rights question in the 50s?
He's an extraordinary man in some ways, considering the fact that he's born in 1880. He reflects 19th century values in so many ways. He was a man with absolutely no racial prejudice feelings whatsoever. It's one of the reasons, one of the things he learned from his father, it's number one, but it's also one of the reasons why he was able to work so well with Asian countries. And was able to build a strong relationship with Asian countries, not just in the Philippines, but in Japan and in China. He is without that kind of virulent feelings with regard to inferior races. It's not how he sees the world. It's an extraordinary story, really.
Let me back up a little bit before he gets to the convention. When the Republican Party announced that Eisenhower was going to give the keynote at the convention, MacArthur was going to give the keynote at the convention, Eisenhower was still over in Europe. He was still commanding NATO. And the day after it was announced that MacArthur was going to give the keynote, Eisenhower sent in his resignation to President Truman and saying he was coming back to fight.
He was afraid he would steal the show.
And he had a heck of a fight at that 52 convention. Annette, why patriarch? What does that mean in the context of Jefferson?
Well, we took this from a letter that he wrote to Angelica Church, Schuyler Church, about...
Which, by the way, for Hamilton fans,
was
Alexander Hamilton's
sister-in-law,
and with whom Hamilton also flirted. So Jefferson's flirting with the same woman that Hamilton did. Was there nothing over which they did not fight?
Probably not. Not very, very many things.
Sorry to interrupt.
But no, but I mean, it's there. It's fair enough. It's irresistible. It's irresistible. He writes to her, and he's been beaten up by Hamilton in Washington's cabinet, and he's about to go home to Monticello. And he says, you know, if all of the things work the way I want them to work, with my daughters there, I have my fields to farm, and all those kinds of things. Very, very nostalgic and sort of brave face that he's putting on. He said, I will consider myself as blessed as the most blessed of the patriarchs. And Peter and I thought that was an interesting way to put it. You know, I mean,
well, he's supposed to be the great Democrat, and how does that fit with this archaic notion of the authority of the father, who is supreme in his domain? But that's the other side of Jefferson, and it's the age. It's not just Jefferson, and that is the head of the family, of the household, which is the central unit of the economy and society, the foundation of the republic. Well, there's no question about the supremacy of the male, of the father. And that's what we see as an interesting contradiction on the face of it, to tease out how could he become the great spokesperson for democracy, the man who gave us the American creed, and live in this apparently archaic way, and with all those slaves. So it brings in all the questions that engage us today. That is, how could he own human beings? Well, how could you be a father, I would ask you?
Right.
Because you'd have that kind of authority over everybody in your household.
Yes, women, lower class whites, everybody. I mean, he's really at the top of the social pyramid, and he was born that way. He was sort of born to this role. But at the same time, he was a man of the Enlightenment. Right. He was captured by a reader, a voracious reader, who was captured by science and the idea of progress. So he weaves that into all of this. Is he's living in this this society that we consider, well, was retrograde by our
standards. Something that we don't think is natural anymore for him was enjoined by nature, and that is, this is the natural way in which the family has to be organized.
Right. It's a final question to all of you, and Arthur, I'm going to start with you, which is you've all written about leaders in the work that you've done, and people who moved mankind through their ideas, through their talents. Arthur, I want to start with you first. When you write about MacArthur, that he could be in command without being commanding. Tell me just a little bit about how he was as a leader of people.
He was extraordinary in this sense that he is, although he projects this enormous self-confidence, bordering on arrogance, he's a man who's consumed, as I discovered writing this book, consumed with insecurities, consumed with self-doubts. And the figures in his life that he turns to for support in all this are the women in his life, starting with his mother, His first wife failed to provide that kind of role, was one of the things that they fell out about. She was like, why can't you be more of a man? Why can't you get out of this dead-end job in the Army and go into investment banking like the rest of my family? And then he finds with his second wife, Jean, that kind of emotional support, someone who can sort out issues and deal with in detail. This is always in the background of his leadership roles. He's an amazing delegator. It's one of the things that even officers who disliked him intensely, and there were a lot of them in the U.S. Army, and also many in the Navy, found this refreshing about him, that his attitude was, I've chosen you because you're the best. And I've given you the assignment that you've got, and I know you're going to fulfill that because you are the best. And I'll just leave you to figure out how it's done. Matthew Ridgway in Korea is the last one to feel that, where he says, Matthew, do what you think is best. And Ridgway is like, that's the best order I've ever received. And he proceeds to turn that war around and drive the Chinese back. It's an enormous gift, and yet at the same time keeps track of all the details. He's aware of everything that's happening as it's happening. At the same time, powerful, might even say photographic memory that allows him to delegate that kind of responsibility because he knows it's not going to spin out of his control.
Very quickly, Gene, what's your sense of the presidents you've written about? What's the leadership quality? We're all looking for leaders now. What do we find in history that tells us what to look for?
I don't know. I've written about Grant and Roosevelt and Eisenhower, and now George W. Bush. And let's take the first three. I think that they came up and understood what the presidency was about. I think neither Grant nor Eisenhower nor Roosevelt tried to run the country simply by saying, I'm the president, I will decide. That distinguishes them from Bush 43, who believed that he was in charge after 9/11. That he was in charge, and not only that he was in charge, but let me go back to this idea that he felt that he was God's agent here on earth and that he was fighting evil. That's the common denominator behind the domestic excesses of his administration and the war in Iraq. And if you believe that you are God's agent here on earth and you're fighting evil, evil deserves no fairness.
Right. No quarter for evil.
No quarter.
Well, and I think that explains the excesses of the Bush administration.
Peter, was Jefferson's pen, was that the way he led, was just by the power of his ideas?
Well, it was his belief in the people, his faith in the people, and the relationship between the modern leader, the decisive, the person who is a change agent, who disrupts things or who makes things anew. Jefferson didn't see himself as a lawmaker. He didn't really see himself as a founder. He saw the republic as the great thing, and in the republic it was the people who mattered. And he is very self-effacing and modest in some ways. This is not me, it's the people. There's a faith in public opinion that God, through the enlightenment that's progressing in his time, will lead the people, will show the people, enable them to identify good leaders who will be the embodiment of their will. This idea of public opinion being unified, that there being a single truth and we're all moving in that direction, that's enormously empowering. In fact, it makes him a very powerful executive, but with this idea that it's not me, it's the people.
Is it the power of providence? Is that what
Yeah,
operates
I think
in that sense? God's will is in
that's
kind of
right.
in the largest sense of the big picture.
I think that's right. It's a God who had a design, and he uses that expression, intelligent design, for the world. We need to discern what that is. And he thought once we discovered Republican government, self-government, then that was the secret, and that would be that would promote progress.
And so if you built the correct system, this representative government, good solutions would kind of bubble out of that, which maybe explains some of the passivity on slavery. Is that,
Yes.
Well, you could not impose a solution. He did not think that there was a Republican solution to it. He knew that the people of Virginia were not, in the 1790s, in his lifetime, going to vote slavery out of existence. But he could not contemplate as he does when there's the Missouri Compromise, and that there could be a war about it, that would eventually be the end result. His hope was that the minds could be changed. That looks to us now as delusional. We know it was delusional, but that was what that's the faith that he had. And his leadership was by consensus, the dinner parties, the notion of love, communication. That would be how people's minds would be changed. It's not an imposition.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you. This has been great fun for me. Thank you all for being here, and a happy 4th of July.
Happy
Thanks, John.
4th to you as well. Very appropriate.